Welcome to another tutorial in Onshape. For this video I want to show you how to actually put a part into Onshape with specific dimensions. So I'm going to say that this part on my page right now is what I want to transfer from a sketch, an isometric sketch, and put it into Onshape. But I need to make sure that I understand how to reference these sizes and these dimensions into Onshape. So I've drawn this at what we consider full scale or life size, and I need to know what each one of these boxes is actually equal to. So I'm going to say right now that my part is 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes tall, and I'm going to say that each one of my boxes is 1/4 of an inch. So from the bottom of the part to the top of the part, looking at just the front view, I have 4/4 of an inch. We're going to go ahead and reduce that 4/4 to 1 inch. So from the bottom of the part to the top of the part, I have 1 inch. And I'm going to do the same thing looking at my overall dimension from side to side. So I'm going to go ahead and count the boxes that I have from side to side in full scale. I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So that ends up being another 4/4, so that's an inch, and then 1, 2. So I have 1.5 inches all the way across, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 boxes. So 6/4, 4/4 and a half, however you want to consider this, it is truly 1 1/2 inches from side to side. So then let's look at our depth, and that will give us all three of our overall dimensions. So I've got 1 2/4 back. So in depth, or for what's going to be my extrusion, that's going to be 2/4 or 1/2 of an inch. So that's all of my overall dimensions. I now need to take a look at any internal dimensions. So right now I know I'm 1 inch tall because this is the same all the way around, but this little tower here, it just happens to be an additional 1/2 of an inch or 2 boxes. So that's going to be 1/2 of an inch wide, and it looks like I have the same thing on the other side. When it comes to actually transferring this from my paper and into the software, I really don't need to know how big that middle is. I know that it's 1/2 inch, but if I tell it that the entire thing is 1.5, and this is 1/2, and that's 1/2, then this is what's left over, and the software will take care of that for me. So I don't actually have to place a dimension inside there at all. What I do still need to know is how deep this cut actually comes in. So I can go ahead and say right now that that's an additional 1/2 of an inch or 2 boxes. That's all the dimensions I need right now to be able to transfer it from my paper and into the software. So I'm going to start off with 1 inch tall, 1.5 wide, 1.5 inch deep, and then these two towers will both be 1/2 inch from each side, and then 1/2 inch down. Okay, so to be able to transfer this into the software, I'm going to do most of it with 2-point rectangles, and there is a whole bunch of different options that I have. Let's take a look at some of the options that I've got. Okay, so I want you to think about if I asked you to find the surface area for this particular shape, most of you would say that I have to break this up into other shapes. So this is a complex shape, it needs to be broken into other shapes. And what kind of shapes can I break it into? So again, I'm going to use the 2-point rectangle, so I'm going to break everything up into rectangles, but there's not just one answer. There's a whole bunch of different ways you could do it. So I want you to think about how could I break this up and what are all the different ways, and then I'm going to pick one of those ways to transfer into the software. So let's look at one of them. You may have just thought about this way. So I can have one large rectangle on the bottom and then 2 rectangles on the top. The nice part is I can lock this corner onto my origin. I can then lock this second rectangle onto here. I can then lock this second rectangle onto there, and that would completely constrain everything that I need. So this is one option that you could transfer into the software, but that's not the only one. So I want you to think about all the different options that you could do to try to create this up. So again, think about surface area. How would you mathematically break this up into simple rectangles? What are your options? And then we're going to choose one of them. So go ahead and pause the video and think about all the different shapes that you could do. Great, so how many did you come up with? I came up with 5 of them. And as I take a look at them, this one was the original, and this one is 3 separate shapes. This one's 3 separate shapes, 3, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. think about why you would not do the surface area for this shape looking at it this way. Hopefully you're thinking that it's just too time consuming, that it's unnecessary. And it's going to be the same thing in the software. This would work, it's just going to be an extra lot of, it's going to be a whole lot of steps. They're just unnecessary, so this is going to be the most inefficient way for me to do it. As far as the rest of them, it's all going to be pretty similar. So I could start this one off of the origin, I could then lock this one on and go up, I could then lock this one on and go up. So each one of these is all going to be fairly similar because they're all the same amount of shapes. But one that you may not have thought about is subtractive. I could think about one solid shape, just a full rectangle, and then only put one square on here. And so then I only have two shapes rather than three shapes. So finding the surface area, I could have done it as one solid and then have subtracted that out. Onshape is okay with these being two separate shapes, and it will actually do this one completely for you and leave that one out. So these are all different options that you can do. I think for right now, I'm going to choose this one. So we're going to go ahead and transfer this one into Onshape using the dimensions that we've already defined. So 1.5 inches across, inch tall, and then everything else is really 1/2 inches, and then it all gets extruded back 1/2 inch. Okay, so let's hop over to Onshape. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder to hold my parts. I'm going to activate that folder, and I'm now ready to go ahead and start my first document. Go ahead and call this Tetris 1. And my first 2D sketch I'm going to put onto the front view. I'm also going to go over here to my view cube, and I'm going to click on front to straighten it up for me. I really encourage you when you're drawing to make your first click on the origin. We'll talk about why that's so important later. So I'm going to grab my first 2-point rectangle, and I'm going to click on the origin. Now I'm not going to worry about any dimensions, any sizing, that kind of stuff. All I'm going to worry about right now is proportions, and we'll get the dimensioning just here in a minute. So if you remember, we're going to do the long rectangle across the bottom and then the two squares on top of that. So yes, I know right now my mouse has dimensions attached to it, but I'm going to ignore those. I really don't care what they say. I'm just going to draw something proportionally the way I want it to look. So I'm just going to draw a rectangle. I'm going to add off of that corner another square about that big, and then on the other corner I'll add another one. So I'm not worried about everything being perfect. If you want to go ahead and play around with proportions and all just a little bit, that's all fine. When I put the first dimension on, it's actually going to shrink or enlarge my entire sketch proportionately. So get everything exactly the way you want it to be, or close enough for what we need, and then we'll start putting on dimensions from there. So I started off with a 2-point rectangle to make the bottom, another 2-point rectangle locked onto this corner with what we call a coincidence, and then another one over here. Okay, so dimensioning is really done in two ways. The first one is I'm just dimensioning afterwards. I do all my drawings and then I dimension, and that's the way I do a good majority of my stuff because I don't always know how big I want things to be until later. So now that I've got it drawn, I'm going to come up here to the dimension tool. It's also D on the keyboard. There are lots of hotkeys that you can push on the keyboard that automatically pop up the tools, and we use D so often that you might want to remember that one. Okay, so I'm going to grab the dimension tool, and most of the time the dimension tool is 2 clicks. So I'm going to come to this bottom line, I'm going to click once, and then the second click you actually have to put the dimension somewhere. So here looks good enough. Now that says 5.12 something or other. I only wanted that to be 1.5. Again, that's not a big deal. I drew things proportionately the way that I want. As soon as I put the first dimension on, everything that's on my screen right now will shrink or enlarge to whatever dimension I put on there. So I'm going to go ahead and put that 1.5 on there, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Everything's going to shrink. So that's what we want. So now I can zoom in on there, and I can start working on the rest of it. So again, most of the time it's going to be 2 clicks. So I'm going to click once and twice. That was supposed to be my 0.5. Then I'm going to click once and twice again, 0.5. I'm just going to start walking around my part. So that's another 1/2 inch. This one's another 1/2 inch, and this one's another 1/2 inch. Now you may have noticed that my shape has actually kind of changed colors a little bit. A minute ago it was all blue, and now it's all black. So what does that color coding mean? When something is completely black, it means that it is fully constrained. It has all the rules on it that are necessary to completely lock it into place. That's things like parallel, perpendicular, dimensions, sizes, locations, all of that is completely done when everything is black. So I'm going to undo a couple just to show you. So now you can see those things are blue. So anything that is blue is something that needs at least one more rule put onto it. You can see like this square here, as soon as I put a height on it, 0.5, that top line is no longer blue. That top line is now black. So now it needs to know where this blue line is located. So click once, click twice, 0.5, and now everything here is all black. If at any point in time you don't know where the dimension belongs, hit escape to drop any tools that you're holding, grab whatever's blue and wiggle it. So I'm just going to grab this blue, and oh, it needs to know how big that goes side to side. It also needs to know how big that goes side or up and down. You can also grab corners, and if the corner will move, then you can see what it's still needing. So I need something to tell it how wide to be, and I need something to tell it how tall to be. Okay, so again, once I'm fully constrained, then I'm ready to finish the sketch. I can always come back into a sketch and change the dimensions later, but if I know them, I like to go ahead and get everything on there and get it fully constrained and then go ahead and finish the sketch. Okay, so you may remember earlier I said that your first click really needs to be on the origin, and I want to explain why. So I'm actually going to draw it not on the origin. So I'm going to draw the exact same thing, just 3 rectangles, and I'm going to start throwing some dimensions on there. So this was 1.5 inches. This one was 1/2, and hopefully what you're noticing already is nothing is turning black. So as I go around the entire part, by now I should have had at least 2 black things, something black, nothing. And I've put all the same dimensions on that I put on earlier, but I have nothing that's telling me that it's done. So I'm going to hit escape, and I said anything that's blue, grab it and wiggle it, especially if you have a corner that's blue. So I grab it, and oh, the whole thing doesn't know where it lives in the environment. So that's what I'm not told it. This origin can't move. That's a fixed point within space. So if I grab my corner down here and I drag that over and link it on, then everything will turn black and it will tell me that I'm completely constrained. So that's why it's so important that your first click actually be onto the origin itself. Otherwise you don't know really when you're done. Okay, so now that we're done with the sketch, let's go ahead and finish sketch and start playing with the extrusion. I'm going to go ahead and turn off all 3 planes at the top, front, and right. Most of the time they're in my way after I've used them the first time. I can always turn them back on later. Okay, let's go ahead and move on with the extrusion. So I'm going to pick extrusion, and I could come over here and just pick all of my shapes. But because I want everything that's here, I can just pick the sketch that's holding the shapes. And I can see right now that that's not the dimension that I want. So right here, I'm going to leave it as blind, and I'm going to change the depth to 0.5. That's the dimension that I want it to be. And hit enter. I can then go ahead and accept that extrusion, and I can go ahead and change this color to something other than blue. Red looks good. Okay, so how can I verify if I actually made the part right? Well, they're all cubes, and each one of the cubes is supposed to be equal. So if I think about maybe the volume, could I find the volume of this part, and will the software show me the volume, and I can evaluate whether I did it right? Well, first of all, I need to know what it's supposed to be. I know each one of these cubes is 1/2 inch tall, 1/2 inch wide, 1/2 inch deep. And height times width times depth will give me the volume of one cube. So 0.5 times 0.5 times 0.5. I end up with 0.125, or 1/8 of an inch cubic for one cube. And then I've got 5 of them, so times 5. So 0.625 or 5/8 cubic inches are what I have here in this part. But will the software show that to me and allow me to prove that I did it right? Well, it will. So I'm going to go ahead and close my calculator. And I'm going to come down here to the bottom corner where this little scale is, the display mass properties. When I click on that display mass properties, right now it won't show anything until you've told it what to evaluate the measurements for, the mass properties for. So you can either click it down here on the side, or you can just highlight it out here in the field. As soon as I do that, it'll tell me that my volume is 0.625 cubic inches and my surface area is 5.5 square inches. So it'll evaluate any shape that you've got, as complex or as simple as it is. And that's really all there is to being able to use the dimension tool to get what you want. But that's only one way to dimension. There are lots of different ways to dimensions. So let's show you at least a second one. So I'm going to create a new part. I'm going to recreate the exact same thing. We're just going to do it a little bit of a different way. This time, instead of just clicking around and making the entire shape, I'm going to dimension on the fly. I'm going to dimension as I go. So watch what's actually happening. As soon as I click on the origin, I start bringing my mouse out, you can see that there are dimensions attached to my mouse. While I still don't care what they say, I'm still just going to go ahead and click them. But as soon as I do, you can see one dimension right now is highlighted. It has a white box around the outside of it. It's allowing me now to type. So I can go ahead and type my 1.5, and as soon as I hit enter, it'll jump to the other box. I can go ahead and type in 0.5 and hit enter. I can do that for any of the boxes that I draw. So it'd be the same thing here. I'm going to click once, go ahead and click twice. It doesn't matter what those boxes say. I can then type in 0.5, enter, 0.5, enter, and that's all done. I can do the last one. Click, click. 0.5, enter, 0.5, enter, and it will do all of that for me right away. Again, I can really only do that if I know the dimensions as I'm going, and if I don't, then I'd rather dimension the other way, where I'm drawing things out proportionally with no dimensions, and then when I put on my first dimension, everything will kind of shrink to that, and then I can kind of mess with the dimensions from there. So regardless, it gives me the same answer. I can go ahead and finish that sketch, I can turn off my planes, I can go ahead and put it in isometric, and I'll go ahead and extrude. Pick my sketch, it grabs everything, ½ inch, and everything should still be the same. So I'll come to my mask properties, I'll go ahead and click on the part, and I should have 0.625 still. Okay? Alright, so that's really kind of how the dimension tool sort of works. I want to show you a couple more things about what the dimension tool does and doesn't do, things that it likes and doesn't like. So let's think about a complex shape. So I'm going to go ahead and start a whole new shape. I'm going to start my new sketch, still on the front plane. This time I'm going to go ahead and draw a little tower that's going to be 1 cube wide, 2 cubes tall. So it's going to be 0.5 wide and 1 tall. Alright, go ahead and finish that sketch and go ahead and extrude it. 1 cube. I'll go ahead and turn off my planes. Okay, I want to draw another one on the front of it. It's going to be a row that's going to lay across the front. So I'm going to create my new sketch. I'm going to click on what is now my front face, and I'll square that up. As I start drawing this next one, again, I kind of want it to lay straight across here. And as you see, I move my mouse over. Sometimes it'll auto-grab some of those points, and then sometimes it won't. So I want to show you kind of how to make some of that happen. So I'm just going to make my rectangle. I know that it is 1.5, enter, 0.5, enter. Oops, that's not right. 1.5, that's weird. There we go, and I actually want it linked onto this bottom. So here's the problem. When I grab this and I try to bring it up, it won't link. It was kind of linking earlier, but it's not linking right now. So if I just draw something and try to link that on, I have a little trick to be able to make that happen. So you can't just grab the line and bring it up here, that doesn't work. But if you grab the corner and act like you're going to link these together, I've not let go of it yet. But as soon as I bring that over to it and then start bringing it away, you see that little dotted line that comes off of there. That tells me that those two will now be connected together. And now it'll just start snapping to it. And it'll start doing the same thing here. Right now it does nothing to the top until I've evaluated and said those two are going to be in line with each other. And now as I bring it up, it will go ahead and start snapping to that location. Okay, so let's go ahead and link it onto the bottom. And I've told it it's going to be a ½ inch tall and ½ inch wide. I've linked it onto there, but I still have something that's blue. I've constrained everything. What else does it not know? Remember, grab anything that's blue and wiggle it. So I'm going to grab this blue and I'm going to, shift it from side to side. So that's what it needs. It doesn't need a size dimension. It needs a location dimension. And these are a little bit different. A lot of times they're 3 clicks. So I'm going to grab my dimension tool. I'm going to click once. I'm going to click twice, so I'm going to dimension from here to here, and then I have to place the dimension somewhere. That's not a dimension I could have done on the fly. So yes, I can save myself time by dimensioning as I go, but that doesn't mean that you're going to get away without using this dimension tool at all. There are still going to be times where you have to tell something where it's located within the volume of something else. And then that's all done. So I can go ahead and put it isometric, I can extrude, I can pick all 3 of those, or same thing, I can just pick the sketch. It'll grab everything, decide what the depth is going to be.
hit enter, and then accept the extrusion. And there we go. So how many cubes is this made out of? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I should end up with the exact same volume that I had a minute ago. 0.625. So that means that I've modeled the part correctly, and it's got all the constraints that it needs. Okay, one last thing. I'm going to come back into the sketch, and I'm going to do what's called over-constraining. I'm going to put on a dimension that really wasn't necessary. So this is completely black. Everything that it needs to know is already there. So if I come and I try to put on another dimension, so I click here and accept that dimension, you can see that it's kind of faded out or light gray. That's a driven dimension. It's not really there. If this one ever changes to like 5/8, then they'll both change. So you can use it as a reference dimension, but other than that, any dimensions that are gray are not really necessary. Just be really careful if you get any that are red. If you get any red dimensions, those usually cause some kind of error, and usually it'll pop up an error and ask you to go ahead and exit out of that and not place that dimension on. So you can put on driven dimensions that are actually related or being driven by another dimension. Just majority of the time I would avoid those unless you really need them. And that's the basics of dimensioning. If you would, go ahead and start applying that skill and that knowledge to your parts and start adding dimensions and constraints to the parts that you're drawing.